Hello, uh, I'm Frankie Roman. I'm currently a faculty member adjunct of the Asian Institute of Management. Uh, I used to run our research and our CSR activities at AIM, and I met Tony some years ago when I started becoming interested in social responsibility as something that goes beyond the corporation and into other areas and other stakeholders. Thank you.
So, what kind of study or research can we do about CSR?
All right. There's a lot of research that's being done in CSR. CSR is almost an industry globally, so there's already a lot that's available. I think the reason I am partnering with BCYF is that we can do research specifically on CSR in the Philippines. I think it's something that we might do later on in terms of CSR in Asia, but right now we are concerned with CSR in the Philippines. When I was with AIM, obviously as the Asian Institute of Management, we are concerned with Asian CSR, but here I feel we can focus on both the general as well as the unique issues of CSR in the Philippines. For example, when we're looking at the CSR here, CSR is very much connected with what the national government's aspirations are. So, for example, if you look at the national economic development plans, they usually involve health, education, poverty alleviation. So this is the kind of issue that resonates in the Philippines. It's not necessarily something that, let's say, the Scandinavians or the North Americans are interested in. It's something that developing countries are interested in, but we think that the Philippines has its own unique foundations of social responsibility as a Catholic country, and also because the Philippine culture allows us to consider aspects of CSR that may be more applicable. So, for example, the bayanihan concept in the Philippines is very much somewhat similar to the town hall concepts that you hear about, but it's very oriented towards the community. And that's where social responsibility starts. As Tony and I have talked about it, although we use the word CSR, corporate social responsibility, as a well-known label, we are concerned really with citizenship, which is to be a good corporate citizen, be a good Filipino citizen, sustainability, which is, of course, the concern with the environment, and being green. Issues, for example, in the Philippines that will become a problem are the cost of energy and the water usage. I think that's a social responsibility problem. I think we're going to have a water crisis at some point. We already have a traffic crisis, for example. And one of the things that we're looking at, for example, is part of social responsibility is managing at a personal level traffic. Traffic is now no longer just a topic of conversation, it's an economic issue. I can get into that later on, but what I wanted to say is that one of the reasons I wanted to focus on CSR in the Philippines is that I think there are interesting things that can happen. The fourth item in CSR is responsiveness. And that came out of the unfortunate fact that the Philippines is probably in the top 5 or top 10 of disasters, mainly because of where we're located and things like that. And I think we know what we mean by disaster. So we're concerned, working again with the government, corporations and the government working together on issues like relief, rehabilitation, reconstruction, etc. So that's one of the reasons I think why we're looking at CSR for research and some of the things that we can do in terms of research in the Philippines. Over to you.
Sir, can you say something about our journey from CSR?
Oh, all right. Well, actually, it overlaps. Two of the reasons that I talked with Tony and I wanted to get together with him. First reason is that he was also interested in taking CSR beyond the confines of the corporation. And secondly, this overlaps with our third topic on the youth. He was very interested in the youth. As you probably know, the BCIF works with schools, and he has his own school. At AIM, most of my students are already graduate students, mid-level executives. So I wanted really to get an understanding of how the youth work. And I had been doing this in the last couple of years outside of Metro Manila. We went to Cebu, to Mindanao. We went to San Carlos, talked to the University of Mindanao. Went to UPLB as opposed to, let's say, UP Manila, to get a sense of what the youth are thinking about. And it was quite encouraging because, for example, I think the youth are very much concerned about the environment. In one sense, they're even more knowledgeable than their parents are about the environment. I think the youth also have a sense of social advocacy and activism. This is as opposed to political advocacy and activism, which is fairly strong. But we're talking now about being socially responsible and being active as in the field of social responsibility. And I think the youth also are the new generation of CSR, in the sense that they are very willing to undertake social entrepreneurship, not just entrepreneurship for making money, but entrepreneurship as a social activity. Doing good and doing well is the old phrase for it. But I think the main interest would be in innovations that combine the environment and entrepreneurship. But just to use a common examples, although this has been going on even before we started the study. You've probably heard of the rags to riches, transforming the work of the Smoky Mountain people into bags and other accessories. That's the kind of social entrepreneurship that we are looking at. There are youth activities, and some of them have been awardees of Tony's Foundation, who have done work on clearing beaches, on concerned about plastic wastes. So I think this is something that the youth are interested in, and I'm particularly excited because this is not a program that you get from a corporation and then just do what the corporation does. This is something that they think about. So when I do work in CSR with corporations and I study them, most of them already have programs. A number of them are global programs. So for example, if you're with the cement companies, you follow the CSR programs of the global cement or the mining companies. Whatever the headquarters says, you try to follow. On the other hand, I think the thing about the youth is they can create their own initiatives. Now, my hope and one of the things I want to research on, but that's a long-term plan, maybe beyond my lifetime, is I'm hoping that the youth will carry out their own ideas when they go into the workplace. Of course, if you're a young graduate, you join a company, you will accept the CSR programs of that company. However, over time, if you continue to work with the company, you can start bringing in your own ideas. So, for example, it may happen that a company is very good in providing income-generating activities. For example, if you're a company in a community, you do a lot of income-generating income-generating activities for communities. However, they may have their own ideas on social entrepreneurship, which a company can then undertake. And of course, I'm not talking about a young graduate. He'll have to be a few years in the company. But I'm hoping they will continue to have their passion and their interest so that they will maintain their own emotional passion and advocacy for whatever it is they're interested in, which then they can translate into perhaps company-wide CSR projects. On the other hand, there are now young people who, when they graduate, say, I want to become an entrepreneur and I want to become a social entrepreneur, which is natural because if you're a graduate from outside of Metro Manila, if you're a graduate from a non-urban area, you'll begin your first job, your first entrepreneurial job with the community you're working on. And that's a natural combination. So anyway, to conclude, both our journeys coincided because Tony has always been interested in the youth, and I became interested in the youth after working for many years already with large corporations and people who have specific budgets for specific activities. Okay, that's it.
Where is CSR now?
That's a good question. In fact, Tony and I were discussing this just about 2 weeks ago. As I was telling Tony, as an academician, we usually label CSR events after it's happened. So we talk about in the Philippines, we talk about the decade of public relations, where CSR was just PR. Then we talk about the decade of community relations, where CSR was intended to engage with communities. Now we're talking about corporate social innovation and lately multi-stakeholder engagement. In other words, it's not just the corporation giving money to a community, it's the community and the corporation and the government and the NGOs working together for particular objectives, whether it's disaster relief or income generation or the environment. So, in fact, what I'm saying is we don't really know what the trends are. We can see several things going on right now. So the current flavor of the month, if you want, is this whole notion of corporate social innovation and corporate social entrepreneurship. So that's clearly one trend that's taking place. The second trend, I think, I'm talking CSR in the Philippines. The second trend, and that's been happening even before Typhoon Haiyan, this thing that the entire public, corporations, schools, hospitals, for example, health agencies, the government, they have to get together for disaster relief. Because one of the big problems, for example, is that, for example, if Makati got flooded, we will probably recover in 6 months. But if a place like Tacloban gets flooded, it may take years before relief can take place. So I think that one of the directions in the Philippines is to look closely at disasters, both natural and even man-made. So for example, Marawi is a man-made disaster, and it still is on its way to recovery. That's the kind of thing where obviously the government is doing its job. But I'm sure there are a lot of NGOs working, for example, in the area of what they call PTSD, post-traumatic stress. Many of the children need that. The schools have to be rebuilt. The health situation is still precarious whenever there's a natural disaster. So I think the trends are the environment, disasters, corporate social innovation and corporate social entrepreneurship. And the future is being, globally, the future of CSR is also evolving. So, for example, just a quick, Africa is now the place where a lot of CSR activities, mainly on the medical issues. I think in the Philippines, it happens to be disasters, but I think that that CSR is now working towards meeting some of the goals that the government is concerned about. Finally, last thing, there is a trend, at least in academics, that governance and social responsibility go together. Social responsibility might mean doing good, but governance means having the appropriate measures for success. How do you know you've succeeded? And governance also has outcomes that are more well defined. So I think there's now a trend towards, they call it responsible governance, which means responsibility and governance. So I think that's becoming a trend, partly because money is tight. People are beginning to ask themselves, if we are going to donate to an activity, what are the expected outcomes, and how do we know we're doing well?
So how can we teach the young in 3 areas? Youth, academic, and corporate.
Okay. My own feeling is that you start teaching the young social responsibility because it's a main value. So I think it should start as early as grade school and certainly in high school. It's much like what the Department of Education and CHED are trying to do. They're trying to instill civic mindedness into the students, and I think things like social responsibility and social entrepreneurship can be taught early on. when I was doing some work in Mindanao and Cebu, there are a number of societies on entrepreneurship, for example, and these are usually at the late high school, early college. So I think the answer about teaching CSR to the youth is start them young, start them early, even in as early as grade school, but most likely high school. How to teach it is more interesting because I think the current youth are more visually oriented. And so one thing Tony and I are experimenting with is, can we develop podcasts so that we can teach the youth CSR so that they can learn it at any time, not only just while they're in school from 8 to 2 o'clock. So maybe we can think of a podcast. Later on, we might want to do short videos. But as you know, the podcast is the easiest thing. And it's very popular abroad, or blog sites. So that's what and how you teach the youth when they're still in school. In terms of academics, we are doing two things. One is very traditionally, we're trying to create a textbook on CSR, short cases and notes on what's happening in CSR, so that the teachers themselves can teach it. So it's a transfer of technology. We're still working at it. It may take a while, but that's one of the things we're doing. We're also working with a couple of schools, but it's still in the experimental stage of seeing if we can develop online blended learning on CSR. We feel that while, unfortunately, while every young person may not have textbooks, they certainly have a smartphone. So how can we generate online learning for them? The traditional teachers will, of course, always use textbooks. That's what they're comfortable with. Although the new generation, I think, is more wired. So we'd be looking at something like, for the teachers, traditional textbooks on CSR, complete with what they call teaching notes and guides for the classroom. For the students, we are thinking of something more electronic, more attuned to their cultural, to the millennials' use of smartphones and always texting and social media, because social media is a powerful tool, and we're trying to see how it can be used for social responsibility. And then in terms of the corporations, now this thing is interesting because it's evolved now towards what they'd call business for society. In other words, business exists because it's supposed to be a service, providing a service to society. And I think corporations have always been doing this. They've noted about CSR executive officers. So I think what's been happening is there's an attempt, and here's the famous phrase for that is called, there's an attempt to glocalize. In other words, headquarters has its own CSR activity. Let's say the headquarters in Makati says we want you to help communities, but then if you're the manager in Mindanao or in Pampanga, you probably have your own idea of how to carry it out. So there's a global or national goal saying, provide assistance to the communities, and you can say, well, how do you want to provide it? Through education. If you're a bank, you might want to have training programs to manage your finances. If you're a pharmaceutical company, you might want to be able to provide training, for example, on communities dealing with senior citizens who are suffering from dementia. So I think the corporations are starting to become more engaged in what communities are doing. And I think this is true not just in the Philippines. I think in the end, you have to have a global grand strategy, but it has to be implemented at the local level. And people have to do things with communities who may have different opinions on what they want and what they think they need.